Paris, autumn of 1797. The streets of the French capital, still bearing the traces of revolutionary chaos, were enveloped in a damp fog, through which the light of gas lamps barely pierced. In this city, where the fate of the monarchy was recently decided, a different atmosphere now reigned, a mixture of decadence, fear, and rampant corruption. Three gentlemen, dressed in strict frock coats, sharply contrasting with the colorful fashion of the Directory, stood in the reception room of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These were Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, envoys of a young, still fragile republic thousands of miles away beyond the cold waters of the Atlantic. They had not come for social pleasantries, but on a mission upon which the very existence of their state depended. They awaited a meeting with Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the legendary and slippery minister whose name was already becoming proverbial. But the doors of the office remained closed. Instead of an official reception, they were met by a game of shadows that would forever change the course of history on two continents. The air in the reception room was heavy, permeated not only by the smell of old paper and wax, but also by unspoken tension. The Americans felt like outsiders at this feast of European diplomacy. They represented a country that many in the old world considered merely a temporary experiment, doomed to failure. The United States of America at the end of the 18th century was in an extremely vulnerable position. Just a decade and a half earlier, they had won independence, but now found themselves caught between two titans engaged in a deadly struggle for world domination: Great Britain and France. London and Paris, like two millstones, ground everything that came between them, and America's neutrality was cracking at the seams. The French Republic, a former ally in the War of Independence, now saw the Americans as traitors. The signing of Jay's treaty with the British was perceived in Paris as a stab in the back. In response, French privateers began a real hunt for American merchant ships. Hundreds of ships were seized, cargo confiscated, and crews thrown into dungeons. The economy of the young country was suffocating, and the nation's pride was wounded. President John Adams, who succeeded the great Washington, understood that war with France could be the end for the Union, which effectively had neither a navy nor a regular army capable of resisting the battle-hardened legions of Europe. That is precisely why the three envoys were in Paris. Their task was simple, yet impossible: to stop attacks on ships and restore diplomatic relations without dragging the country into war. But Directory France lived by different rules. Here, the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had long given way to cynical pragmatism and greed. While the Americans awaited an official audience, strange visitors began to call on them. These were not officials whose names could be found in state registers. These were intermediaries, agents, shadows, acting on Talleyrand's unspoken instructions. Subsequently, in the reports sent to Philadelphia, their names would be hidden behind the letters X, Y, and Z, turning a diplomatic incident into a spy thriller. The first blow was struck suddenly and with disarming directness. The agents informed the American delegation that several preliminary conditions had to be met before negotiations could begin. These conditions came like a bolt from the blue. First, President Adams was to issue an official apology for his critical remarks about France in a recent address to Congress. This demand in itself was humiliating, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. Second, the United States was to provide France with a massive state loan of $10 million. And finally, the third condition, which was voiced with a cynical smile, concerned Minister Talleyrand personally. For his office doors to open and his ears to become receptive to the envoy's arguments. A douceur, a bribe of $250,000, was required. $250,000. In late 18th century prices, this was a colossal fortune, an amount capable of building several warships or arming a small army. For a young republic whose budget was bursting at the seams, it was unthinkable. But it wasn't even about the money. It was about principle. Talleyrand's agents, Jean-Conrad Oettinger, Pierre Bellamy, and Lucien Hauteval, spoke of it as a matter of course. They explained that this was how things were done in Europe, that it was the entry fee to the club of great powers. They hinted at the might of the French army, at the fate of Venice and Holland, which had already fallen under the onslaught of revolutionary troops. "You don't want the same thing to happen to your country, do you?" was implied in their insinuating voices. This was blackmail, undisguised and brazen. The reaction of the American delegates was instantaneous and furious. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a man of honor and the old school, exploded in indignation. Legend has it that it was at this moment he uttered the phrase that would later become famous, although historical documents preserved a more prosaic, yet no less firm, answer. "No! No! And again no! Not a sixpence!" Americans were ready to discuss compensation for captured goods. They were ready to seek compromises in trade, but to pay tribute, to buy the right to speak. This went against the very essence of their mission and the dignity of their nation. John Marshall, the future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, with his cold and analytical mind, understood that agreeing to these terms would turn the United States into a vassal of France. Elbridge Gerry, most inclined to compromise and fearing war above all else, was also shocked by the cynicism of what was happening. For several weeks, the agents continued to besiege the delegation, changing tactics from threats to persuasion. They painted pictures of ruined American cities, burned shipyards, and a coastal blockade. They claimed that there was a strong French party in America that would overthrow the Adams government if the treaty was not signed. This was a psychological attack, calculated to break the will of the envoys, to make them feel insignificant before the grandeur of France. But the effect was the opposite. Instead of fear, a cold determination grew in the hearts of the Americans. They realized that they were dealing not with partners, but with extortionists. Marshall and Pinckney decided to break off the negotiations, which had never even begun, and send a detailed report to the president. Gerry remained in Paris, hoping to somehow maintain a thread of dialogue, but his colleagues were already packing their bags, taking with them documents that were to explode the political situation in Philadelphia. Meanwhile, in the United States, the situation was heating up to the limit. John Adams was in the position of a man walking a tightrope over an abyss during a hurricane. Domestically, a political war raged between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and his supporters were convinced that France was a beacon of liberty, and Adams and the Federalists were deliberately sabotaging relations with Paris to draw closer to monarchical Britain. They accused the president of militarism, of wanting to create a tyranny. Adams, possessing a complex character, prone to doubts and long deliberations, but at the same time an unshakably honest patriot, felt isolated. He knew that the country was not ready for war. America had virtually no navy. The last ships of the Continental Navy had been sold years ago for debts. Coastal defense was laughable. When the encrypted dispatches from Paris reached Philadelphia in early March 1798, Adams locked himself in his study. What he read shocked him. He had expected difficulties, but not such blatant humiliation. The French foreign minister demanded a bribe. This was not just a diplomatic insult, it was a challenge to national sovereignty. Adams's first reaction was a desire to conceal these details. He understood that publishing the documents would cause an explosion, the consequences of which were unpredictable. He feared that war would become inevitable, and war could destroy the fragile republic. However, the Republicans in Congress, unaware of the true contents of the dispatches, decided that Adams was hiding favorable news to justify his anti-French policy. They began to pressure the president, demanding that he make the envoys' correspondence public. They were convinced that this would expose Adams's duplicity and prove France's peaceful intentions. This was a fatal mistake by the opposition. Adams, cornered, made a decision that became a turning point in his presidency. He sent the documents to Congress, having first replaced the names of the French agents with code names: Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, and Monsieur Z. When congressmen and senators began to read the reports, a deathly silence fell over the hall, followed by a murmur of disbelief and then a storm of indignation. The text spoke for itself. French diplomacy appeared in all its corrupt nakedness. The demand for a bribe, threats, contempt, all became public knowledge. The bombshell effect was instantaneous. The news spilled from the halls of Congress onto the streets of Philadelphia, and then, like a wildfire, spread throughout all the states. Illusions about a sister republic collapsed overnight. The very people who only yesterday had toasted the French Revolution and worn tricolor cockades now tore them off and trampled them in the mud. The nation, recently divided in two, suddenly felt a powerful surge of unity. It was a feeling of wounded pride that united farmer and banker, Southerner and Northerner. In taverns, in city squares, in newspapers, the same motif sounded. This motif crystallized in the slogan attributed to Robert Goodloe Harper, spoken at one of the banquets in honor of Marshall's return. "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." These words became the motto of the era, the battle cry of a generation that refused to bow its head before European monarchs or revolutionary dictators. John Adams, who had recently been criticized from all sides, suddenly became a national hero. Crowds of people singing patriotic songs surrounded his residence. The specially written anthem, "Hail Columbia," blared from every window. But for Adams, this popularity was bitter. He understood that the people's anger demanded an outlet, and that outlet could only be action. The quote won. That's what historians would call this conflict, for war was never officially declared, but it became a reality in the waters of the Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea. Adams, despite pressure from radical Federalists who demanded a full-scale invasion and an alliance with Britain, chose a strategy of limited naval warfare. He needed to protect trade but not drag the country into a global conflict. It was at this moment that one of the most powerful institutions in U.S. history was born. Realizing that without a strong navy, the country would always be a victim of extortionists, Congress authorized the creation of a separate Department of the Navy. A feverish construction began. Axes hammered in the shipyards of Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The best shipwrights, using the strongest Virginia oak, created a new class of ships, heavy frigates. These were vessels that combined the power of a ship of the line with the speed of a corvette. Constitution, United States. Constellation. These names would soon thunder across the world. Adams personally oversaw this process, understanding that these wooden walls were the only guarantee of independence. The sea became the arena where the young nation proved its right to exist. American captains were authorized to attack armed French ships. It was a clash of David and Goliath. The French fleet was one of the strongest in the world, but the Americans compensated for their lack of numbers with audacity and skill. Captain Thomas Truxton, on the frigate Constellation, engaged the French frigate L'Insurgente in the waters of the Caribbean Sea. It was a clash not just of two ships, but of two wills. Despite stormy weather, American gunners demonstrated deadly accuracy. The masts of the French ship fell, and L'Insurgente was forced to strike its colors. This victory, the first major victory of the American Navy over a European power, caused ecstasy in the U.S. It proved that Talleyrand's threats were empty if they were not backed by the ability to carry them out, and that Americans were capable of defending their honor by force of arms. In just 2 years, American ships captured over 80 French armed vessels. Trade routes were cleared, insurance rates for maritime transport plummeted, and the nation's prestige soared to unprecedented heights. But while cannons roared at sea, an even more dramatic battle unfolded in the president's office. Adams found himself in a paradoxical situation. His own party, intoxicated by successes at sea, demanded a continuation of the war until a triumphant end. Alexander Hamilton dreamed of creating a vast army, at the head of which he would stand himself, perhaps to march on Spanish colonies. The war became a profitable political tool for the Federalists, allowing them to suppress opposition with draconian Alien and Sedition Acts. But John Adams was a visionary. He saw further than his ambitious associates. He understood that a protracted war with France would ultimately destroy the U.S. economy and make it dependent on Britain. He knew that Napoleon Bonaparte, who had come to power in France, was also not interested in conflict with America, as his gaze was fixed on Europe and Egypt. Adams received signals from Talleyrand, who, realizing the miscalculation with the demand for a bribe and seeing the teeth of the American fleet, sharply changed his tone and hinted at a readiness to receive new envoys with due respect. Adams faced a choice that defined his place in history: to continue the war, which guaranteed him an easy re-election for a second term on a wave of patriotism and party support, or to take a risk and send a new peace mission, which would mean a break with his own party and political suicide. It was a choice between personal gain and the good of the country. The president's internal struggle was agonizing. He knew that Hamilton and his faction would never forgive him for attempting reconciliation. But he also remembered why this republic was created, not for conquests and the glory of generals, but for the peace and prosperity of its citizens. In early 1799, to the astonishment and fury of the Federalists, Adams announced the appointment of new envoys to France. It was a unilateral, decisive action. Quote, "1, he declared. The party elite perceived this as a betrayal. The cabinet sabotaged the mission's preparation, but Adams was unyielding. The envoys departed for Europe. The negotiations were long and difficult. Napoleon, who had already become first consul, was a tough negotiator, but he was a pragmatist. He needed peace at sea to focus on the war with Britain. Consequently, on September 30, 1800, the Treaty of Mortefontaine was signed. The quasi-war officially ended. France agreed to annul the old alliance treaty of 1778, which dragged America into European conflicts, and recognized the rights of neutral vessels. The U.S., in turn, renounced claims for compensation for previously seized goods. This was the price that had to be paid for peace and the dissolution of the binding alliance. News of peace reached America too late to help Adams in the elections. As he had foreseen, his party split. Radical Federalists, deprived of their glorious war, turned against him. Jefferson's Republicans took advantage of this split and won the election of 1800. John Adams became the first president not to be re-elected for a second term. He left the White House, then still simply the president's house, early in the morning, alone, feeling the bitterness of defeat and the injustice of his contemporaries. However, history put everything in its place. Adam's sacrifice was not in vain. He prevented a full-scale war that could have strangled the young nation in its cradle. He broke the fetters that bound the USA to European politics and laid the foundation for true neutrality. But perhaps his most important legacy was how the nation reacted to humiliation. The "scandal" became a vaccination against an inferiority complex. Americans realized that respect in the international arena cannot be begged or bought. It can only be compelled by having strength and determination behind one. The fleet, born in the crucible of this conflict, was not disbanded. The frigates built at Adams' command would soon prove themselves again in the wars with the Barbary pirates and in the War of 1812. The principle of "millions for defense but not a cent for tribute" became not just a beautiful phrase, but a cornerstone of American foreign policy for centuries to come. This was a story of how an attempt at corrupt blackmail led to the consolidation of the nation and its transformation from a passive observer into an active player, ready to defend its interests by any means. John Adams, already a very old man, reflecting on his tumultuous life, said that he would like to see one single epitaph on his grave. Here lies John Adams, who took responsibility for peace with France in the year 1800. He understood that this peace, achieved through a display of force and subsequent wise self-restraint, was his greatest gift to future generations. In this story, base greed and high honor, political intrigues and naval romance, weakness and strength were intertwined. And it was in this crucible of contradictions that the character of a state was finally formed, which declared to the whole world, "You cannot speak to us in the language of ultimatums." The consequences of those years are still felt today. Every time diplomacy reaches a dead end and clouds gather on the horizon, one recalls that cold Parisian fog and the three people who found the courage to say a firm no to the powerful of this world. It was a lesson in dignity worth millions. And the echo of the constellation's cannon salvos piercing through the centuries reminds us that sovereignty is not a gift, but a heavy burden that one must be prepared to carry, regardless of the cost. The story of the Quasi-War and the XYZ Affair is not just an episode from a textbook. It is a fundamental myth of coming of age, of the transition from adolescent dependence to adult responsibility for one's destiny. And although the names of agents X, Y, and Z have sunk into oblivion, remaining only as footnotes in archival documents, the spirit of resistance that they unwittingly awakened lives on to this day.